A greedy and envious man met the king. The king said to them, "One of you may ask something of me, and I will give it to him, provided I give twice as much to the other." The envious man didn't want to ask first, because the greedy man would receive twice as much as he did. The greedy man did not want to ask first, because he wanted to have everything for himself. Finally, the greedy man pressed the envious man to make the first request. So the envious man asked the king to pluck out one of his eyes, knowing that the greedy man would have both his eyes plucked out. This is envy, and why it is so nasty a sin. Welcome to Thinking Wisely with Dr. Isley, where we learn to live wisely by thinking wisely. In page 61 of his book, The Seven Deadly Sins Today, Henry Fairley comments, "Envy is the one deadly sin to which no one readily confesses." We don't want to confess to envy because it is a thoroughly nasty sin. In order to understand why envy is so despicable, we need first to define it. I borrowed the parable of the envious and greedy man from the psychotherapist Solomon Schimmel. On page 57 of his book, The Seven Deadly Sins, Schimmel defines envy as the pain we feel when we perceive another individual possessing some object, quality, or status we do not possess. In this, he follows the traditional understanding of envy that goes all the way back to Aristotle. Medieval Christians agreed. In fact, John of Damascus, the 7th and 8th century Orthodox monk, defined envy succinctly as sorrow for another's good. As with all the deadly sins, envy flows from pride. Pride is an exaggerated sense of our own importance or accomplishments. Envy feels that the success or status of another person diminishes our own worth. Shockingly, envy does not necessarily want what the other person possesses or his success. It just resents that someone else has it. This is why it is so perverse. We'll see this perversity and the destructive nature of envy in the biblical story of the two brothers Cain and Abel. Before we look at that story, we need to distinguish envy from two other closely related emotions: covetousness and jealousy. Covetousness is condemned by the 10th commandment in Exodus 20:17 and by Jesus in Mark 7:22. It differs from envy in relation to the desire for the possessions of others. Envy resents their possessing them, but does not necessarily desire what the other person has. Covetousness does desire what belongs to others. In general, we envy people, but we covet possessions. Jealousy is often used synonymously with envy, but strictly speaking, there is a distinction. As defined above, envy is the pain we feel at someone else's good. It is not a good that we necessarily possess. In contrast, jealousy is the desire to maintain what is ours. If the object desired is rightfully ours and not valued more highly than it should be, then jealousy is not a sin. For example, God is described as a jealous God because he rightfully claims his name or status as the only being worthy of our worship and wholly dedicated service. Exodus 25 and 34:14. The Christian should also be jealous of God's name and so praise, "Hallowed be your name," or "May you, O God, receive the honor that is your due." However, it is wrong to seek or guard for ourselves what is not truly ours, or value inordinately what we do possess. This latter desire is sinful jealousy. The scriptures make clear the dire consequences of the sin of envy. Proverbs 14:30 warns, "A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot." In contrast to a tranquil heart, envy is restless and destructive to the inner person. It is like a cancer that destroys the envious, eating away at joy and peace. The story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4 illustrates how the internal workings of envy result in harm to others. Abel and Cain offer sacrifices to the Lord. Abel's is accepted, but Cain's is rejected. We are told that Cain became very angry and his face fell. In other words, he responds with anger and the feeling of being ashamed. However, his anger and shame are not because he was rejected by God, but rather because his brother's sacrifice had been accepted. God rebukes Cain for his anger and feeling of humiliation and tells him, if you do well, will you not be accepted? Cain will be accepted by God if he offers his sacrifice properly. This Cain does not do. Instead, he kills his brother Abel, which leads to his judgment by God. What embittered Cain was envy of his brother. That his brother was accepted by God galled him. He would rather kill his brother than be accepted by God. Such is the strength of envy's rage. Envy is fundamentally a failure of love. We are commanded to love our neighbor as ourselves. Mark 12:31. Paul's panegyric on love in 1 Corinthians 13 tells us love does not envy because it is not in competition with others. It is not resentful, but it is joyful. Verses 4 to 6. Envy is also a failure of faith and hope. Love rejoices with the truth. 1 Corinthians 13:6. Envy does not want to accept the truth that God is greater than we are. Its competitive nature and exclusive focus on the self means that it refuses to give itself fully to God in worship and obedience. It does not want Him to have the glory. Love also hopes all things. 1 Corinthians 13:7. Hope leads us to humble ourselves before God and trust in His promise to exalt us in due time. 1 Peter 5:6. Envy is resentful of God's greatness. It feels humiliated and angry. As does pride, it hates humility. What can we do to overcome envy? Here are 5 suggestions. First, recognize your true status as one created in the image of God. Second, focus on and name the good things or blessings that you have. Then thank God for them. Third, if you have trusted in Christ for your salvation, rejoice in the fact that you are a child of His, the King of Kings. Fourth, be content with what you have. And fifth, practice thanking God for the successes and blessings that others have. Of course, all of these suggestions assume that we have God's grace to help us overcome envy, because we cannot overcome it by our own efforts. If you have any other suggestions for overcoming envy, please leave them in the comments. If you want to receive these videos automatically, please click on the subscribe button below. Thank you for listening.